Hey everybody, we're going to continue our talk today on emancipation, the conundrum of emancipation. We're calling this lecture, and I'll flip here. Get this to work. There we go. The Battle of Antietam. We spoke about it last time, and it's clearly one of the crucial turning points in the Civil War. And Lee's failed invasion culminated in the bloodiest single day in American history. But the more lasting impact of Antietam was that it opened the door for something Lincoln had been working on for the entirety of 1862. And it was pressed by current events such as enslaved people fleeing to the north, the Union public demanding victory, and his own changing conscience. Lincoln would sneak away from the White House each day and walk to a locked desk at the Naval War College. In that desk were Lincoln's scribbled draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, which in its preliminary form of September 22nd, 1862, transformed the purpose of the Civil War. Now, that document transformed the war into a different kind of conflict, reorienting the purpose of Lincoln's war machine. But emancipation also introduced something neither Lincoln or others completely understood at that time, something that cracked open a door to the true fulfillment of Americans' founding principles. And now, a dog has just come in. He learned how to open the door all by himself. Here's Oyster. Say hey. Everybody's taking their notes. So they can look at you too. All right, let's get you on the bed. All right. There you go. Anyway, sorry about that. I also decided that this having a video is kind of pointless. Looking at, just having me here talking. It's no need for that. And I also need a haircut, something terrible. So we'll get rid of it. Anyway, Antietam represented a military shift in first repelling Lee and the Confederate Army, and in its emancipation, which is so hotly debated for all of 1861 to 62, represented the single greatest turning point in the Civil War. The emancipation of approximately 4 million enslaved people in the United States in the midst of what the proclamation would help transform into an all-out total war by the North and South, was a factor that would make it necessary for the Union to destroy Southern society and its central institution, slavery, and eventually transform American history. More than just this single war, this military strategy became something bigger than a battle. And we spoke about the other day about the dynamic in the early part of the war where Lincoln is being assaulted. Assault is not the right word, but by abolitionists in the papers. And assaulted is the right word. And they wanted a war for abolition, a war for Black freedom, a war of emancipation. And they wanted this to be a war, it's less about union, but more about emancipation. Yeah. One of the folks pressuring Lincoln was Frederick Douglass. He relentlessly pressed Lincoln. In late 1861, he called the president the most powerful slave catcher in the world. That was Douglas's opinions of Lincoln's denial of asylum policy. That was a policy of the United States which returned fugitive enslaved people to their owners if their owners were loyal. It would return the fugitive slaves to loyal owners. Douglass, like many others, was outraged by Lincoln's capitulation on asylum. And we can read this here. And this is February of 1862. This is what he said about abolishing slavery. They are men, they have toiled, they can be citizens. But Douglass was getting impatient with Lincoln in 1862, said with bitter sarcasm, it is really wonderful how all efforts to evade, postpone, and prevent the coming of Black freedom have been mocked and defied by this stupendous sweep of events. And what does that mean? Douglass and other abolitionists believed in the inevitability of this war over slavery turning into a war to free the enslaved people and destroy the institution of slavery. And the events of the spring, fall, summer, fall of 1862 swung Lincoln around that stupendous sweep of events finally carried Lincoln along. And with starts, Lincoln moving towards doing something about slavery were enslaved people themselves. Those enslaved people that went into Fort Monroe. I'm going to give you this little anecdote from General Benjamin Button, who is the next person who somewhat forces Lincoln's hand. After Butler declared slaves contraband, a Virginia officer representing their owner asked for them to be returned. That's great. I intend to hold them, Butler told the man. Do you mean then to set aside your constitutional obligation to return them? The Virginian asked. I mean to take Virginia at her word as declared in the Ordinance of Secession passed yesterday. I am under no constitutional obligations to a foreign country, which Virginia now claims to be. But you say we cannot secede, he answered, and so you cannot consistently detain the Negroes. And Butler says, but you say you have seceded, so you cannot consistently claim them. I shall hold these Negroes as contraband of war, since they are engaged in the constitution of your battery and are claimed as your property. The question is simply whether they shall be used for or against the government of the United States. Yet, though I greatly need the labor which has providentially come to my hands, if Colonel Mallory will come to the fort and take the oath of allegiance to the United States, he shall have his Negroes. Butler's contraband is followed by something called the First Confiscation Act, August of 1861. This was a legal document that permitted Union forces to confiscate Confederate property. But because Lincoln is worried about the border states and he still wants the South back, the First Confiscational Act mentions enslaved people as property, and their status is still very vague. So even with Butler and the First Confiscation Act, Lincoln stays silent. Lincoln spends a long time seemingly doing nothing about emancipation. The legends about Lincoln make it complicated to sort out meaning and intent of emancipation. Some legends have him as the kind of amiable storytelling, rail-splitting frontier folk hero. Others depict him more as a towering political genius, moral leader, shaper of a nation's destiny, savior of the Union, the great emancipator. Lincoln was incredibly difficult to pin down. Lincoln was never an abolitionist. He actually had a lot of personal contempt for abolitionists. He didn't like a lot of their arguments or their strategies. So we find ourselves asking over and over, was Lincoln a racist who held up emancipation, or is he a man who outgrew his prejudices and those of his time as well, and to become the great emancipator? Other options, Lincoln simply was a cold, hard as nails, shrewd politician, finding the middle ground and working it, right? W.E.B. Du Bois, probably the most important Black intellectual of the 20th century, captured Lincoln perfectly. I love him. I'll let you read this. This is what he said of Lincoln. But what he is saying is that Lincoln could grow, change his mind, incorporate new things into his wheelhouse. Lincoln had the capacity for growth. And if you read any of Lincoln's writings, which you should, they're quite eloquent, you can find in his writings nearly every possible perspective. You can find the racist willing to preserve slavery for the moral crusader, you can see the free soiler, the abolitionist, and the Union man all there. As I mentioned, these pesky enslaved people that forced Lincoln and his government to make some moves. The situation that Butler faced at Fort Monroe was everywhere there was a Union line in 1862. That is, enslaved people in the South saw freedom awaiting for them in the shape of Union troops. By the spring of 1862, Congress got ahead of the president and decided any fugitive slave who escaped the Union lines must be accepted. And on April 16th of 62, Congress ended slavery in the District of Columbia. They compensated slave owners in the district and put up money for possible colonization of blacks to foreign countries as a result of emancipation, a policy the Lincoln administration initially did support. And finally, to be clear how radical this is in the context of what got the country into this mess. In June of 62, Congress, by majority vote, abolish slavery forever in the Western territories. Here's Congress saying to the Supreme Court of the Dred Scott decision, you're wrong. Congress is saying, you know, those struggles from Missouri Compromise up to secession. Well, forget that. Finally, July 17th of 62, Congress passed what was called the Second Confiscation Act. And this law explicitly freed slaves of all persons, quote, in rebellion. I'll say that again, the Second Confiscation Act. Maybe we should learn that one, huh? Explicitly freed slaves of all persons, quote, in rebellion, anywhere. So this measure freed any enslaved person in places that were supporting the Confederacy. It did everything the Emancipation Proclamation would later do and more. It was in some ways more extensive because the language is more broad than the eventual proclamation. But at this moment that Lee was moving into Virginia, Maryland, starting his ill-fated offensive. So the military situation was not going well for the Union. Lincoln was preparing the rhetorical accompaniment to the government policies. He was going to make the confiscation of freed slaves matter. But even while Lincoln drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, the president, this complex man, secretly held meetings with representatives from Delaware and Kentucky, trying to convince them to institute gradual emancipation plans with compensation to enslavers. This was Lincoln the gradualist, slow moving still. This was Lincoln trying to measure, prepare, and meet public opinion. And even in August of 62, a month before Lincoln will change the course of American history, he's sounding more like the Lincoln of 1860. He's trying to reassure the border states so that they don't secede. He remarked, quote, I will save the Union by freeing all the slaves, or I will save the Union by freeing none of the slaves. My aim in the end is to save the Union. And that is Lincoln as a pragmatist. He could not issue his proclamation without a battlefield victory. And that came with Antietam. Another way in which Antietam is important. 5 days after the battle, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And what does this document say? It says that enslaved people in the United States, in the states of rebellion, would be freed on January 1st. But Lincoln, ever complex, was always inviting the Confederate states to throw down their arms, give up the war, come back to the Union by January 1st. Of course, that wasn't going to happen because McClellan and the other general, Brule, B-R-U-E-L-L, failed to pursue their Confederate opponents. Lincoln had to re-examine the military debacle that he's been dealing with since the war started. And Lincoln put pressure on his new generals. And the result was an uncommon thing for warfare in those days, winter campaigns. In December of 1862 and into the following January, mid-19th century militaries usually followed the rhythms of the season. You fight in the spring, the summer, and the fall. You take the winter off. How come? Well, it was hard to provision armies in the winter. On the basic level, these armies were incredibly difficult to feed and take care of any time of year. Now, think of these armies as cities that move around. So every time McClellan's army stopped in a campaign against, say, Richmond, his army became the second largest city in the entire CSA. Only New Orleans had more people. That's crazy, huh? These men have to be fed. Thousands of animals that move the army had to be fed. Logistically, it's extremely difficult to maintain armies. So, as a rule, take the winter off. But this particular winter, there would be a campaign because Lincoln so desperately wanted victories. And it was a grim season for the United States. This is one place where Lincoln's military leadership faltered some, perhaps. The Western theater. Mixed verdicts, mixed results. Stone River at the end of 62, Stone River slash Murfreesboro. That's how you pronounce that, I guess. Last day of 1862 up into the first couple days of 63. General Rosecrans, Rosecran, federal troops fought General Braxton Bragg and the Confederates to a stalemate in this battle in Tennessee. Bragg retreated, but like those who came before him, Rosecrans did not pursue Bragg, who retreated deeper into Tennessee, so it was not a decisive victory. And then there's Vicksburg. Same winter, Ulysses S. Grant was trying to capture Vicksburg, which was the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. He was trying to carry out Scott's Anaconda plan that we spoke of earlier. He thought he would just move on the town from three directions. It was well fortified, dug in place, Vicksburg was. He tried over and over again to take the city, but he just could not do it. It's frustrating again and again, over and over. So he just began to lay siege. So in the West, things did not go all that well for the Union as well. And in the Eastern, full of disaster. In the Eastern theater, things were going terribly, terribly, terribly wrong for the United States as Robert E. Lee won some of his most famous victories between December of 62 and May of 63. The first was the Battle of Fredericksburg, December 13th, 62. Ambrose Burnside marched south towards Richmond. He hoped to force Lee to fight on unfavorable ground. In the end, it was Burnside who would be caught in a terrible position. Union soldiers attacked on a long afternoon and were slaughtered. It was a horrible defeat for the United States, vastly outnumbered Lee's army. But Lee's army had such good positions that were easily able to slaughter each wave of U.S. troops that Burnside sent in. Fredericksburg really killed Northern morale. These futile assaults against these impregnable positions on high grounds, 12,500 U.S. soldiers fell, and news from the battle cast this pall over the Northern public. Lincoln was in despair. When he heard news, he said, quote, "If there's a worse place than hell, then I'm in it." The public in the North was upset, and Lincoln was becoming increasingly unpopular. Now, Chancellorsville, Lincoln switched commanders again, still searching for competent leadership. Union forces then went at Lee with 135,000 to Lee's 65,000 men in the Chancellorsville campaign in May of 63. This was Lee's most famous victory, and Lincoln was even in a worse place than before. So, an enormous blow for Lincoln, for the Union, for the North, worse than Fredericksburg. Lincoln's response, quote, my God, what will the country say?" Lee achieved unparalleled stature in the Confederacy. He was considered all but invincible at that moment. It prompted him to make another invasion of Union territory, which was not a good idea. So, morale on the home front. These campaigns had enormous impact on the home fronts of both the North and the South, and we'll talk about a little bit more about this later next time. In the North, Northern morale dropped to one of its all-time lowest points. Only the summer of 64 was worse. There's great unhappiness with emancipation. Many were very uncomfortable with a war for emancipation. Democrats were opposed. They said they were willing to fight for the Union, but not to free blacks. Gold prices were fluctuating in the North, and the economy appeared to be teetering on the brink, kind of like today. And worst of all, the United States instituted a national draft in March of 63, forcing men into the Army, whereas before it was volunteer. The Union conscription law drafted every able-bodied man 20 years of age to 20 to 45 years old. Exemptions were more limited, but there were ways you could get out. So, for example, you could find a substitute and pay $300. Hence, the charge was not inaccurate that in the North that this was a people's war, as Lincoln called it. This war to save democracy became a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. You've probably heard that before, rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Generous bounties were paid if you enlisted, and in the end, only about 6% of all the Union forces in the Civil War were draftees. The social pressures in some communities, since regiments were formed locally at this time, were enormous, especially in the first 2 years. Approximately 20% of all Confederates were draftees and only 6% of Union troops. This is a great change in U.S. history. The Confederacy had actually beaten the Union to it. This is a major step towards mobilizing the entire society to fight the war. It was quite controversial. This gave a group known as the Copperheads an incredible amount of leverage. These were Democrats who were opposed to Lincoln and increasingly opposed to the war. We'll talk more about them during Lincoln's re-election campaign. Now, the South, actually, let's just leave this up. On the Confederate side, these campaigns in Virginia made morale soar. Quite the opposite. Excuse me. In spite of the fact the war was taking a heavy toll on Southern society as well. There were food shortages, there were bread riots, backlashes against conscription. But many in the Confederacy had the sense that it would not last much longer, as Lee seemed to be at the height of his powers and victory seemed close. The big question from the summer of '62 through the eve of Gettysburg is what the effect of the Emancipation Proclamation issued on January 1st, '63 would be. And not surprisingly, the measure validated Southerners who took it as proof that Lincoln had caused secession in '61. Quote, an incitement to slave insurrection or a hypocritical Yankee trick. But this was a measure designed to deplete the laboring population of the enemy. Like so many of the nation's dearest documents, the proclamation came to mean something more only because of the generations that followed. That is, the meaning that other people brought to the Emancipation Proclamation. By the time of the proclamation, about 100,000 slave people had already been declared contraband in Tennessee, Louisiana, and Virginia. But Lincoln's measures was more important than mere numbers of enslaved people. Among African Americans, especially those still enslaved, it was a cause for celebration. It effectively announced a new meaning for the war, as the Civil War historian James McPherson said, quote, the North was now fighting to create a new union, not to restore an old one. And one way to understand the impact of emancipation is one of the interviews conducted by the WPA Oral History Project in the 1930s. These were interviews, of approximately 3,000 of them, done with ex-enslaved people. Many of them at this time were in their 80s or 90s, obviously. And one interviewer, a Black person interviewing, working for the WPA, spoke with a man named Cornelius Garner, who was 91 in 1937. So that means he was about 26 when the preliminary emancipation was issued. And he was asked about the war. Did I fight in the war? Well, if I hadn't, you wouldn't be sitting there writing at me today. Cornelius explained the day of the official Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863. Before 1863, slave auctions in his native Norfolk, Virginia, were always held on New Year's Day. But, quote, that day, that New Year's Day, Cornelius said, should be kept by all the colored people. That is the day of freedom. So emancipation transformed the purpose of the war. Emancipation, more than anything else, made the Civil War a war of conquest, a war of near totality on both sides. And it meant now this was going to be a war of conquest of the South's social and economic institutions. It meant it would only end in unconditional surrender. So we will stop here and continue later on and I hope everyone is doing well.